The cold came with a memory, creeping under stone the way water steals into a cellar and hardens there. In the pre-dawn dark, Winterfell breathed smoke and frost. The old castle wrapped round its fear and hope alike. On the walls men stamped their feet and blew into their hands, and the sound carried, thin as a prayer. Beneath them, the yard was a black sea of motion. Unsaddled horses shifting, grooms whispering quickly, whetstones on blades, ropes drawing tight on the great trebuchets, and every so often the dry clack of dragonglass being tested against metal. Torches sketched brief flowers of light and died. The sky had the look of iron just before the beating begins. Tormund Giantsbane stood in the gate shadow, big shoulders cloaked in furs that seemed made of mountain. Even Winterfell stones looked smaller when he leaned on them. Frost bit his beard and stuck there like a crown. He watched the men of the north, the men with their pale eyes and the memory of winter in their bones, and beyond them the smooth ranks of the Unsullied standing like a wall that had learned to breathe. To the right he could smell the horses of the Dothraki, the matter-of-fact stink of sweat and leather and oil, and the restless shiver of riders who had spent too long under roofs. He had been in the dark before, in the true dark that ate the sky at Hardhome and turned breath to smoke you could not warm. He remembered how the dead moved as one tide and many hands, and how the living broke like driftwood. He looked at the trenches carved into the black field, long curving mouths ready to be set alight, and he looked beyond them to the bare land and the pale line of the godswood, and he thought, you cannot meet a sea where it has nothing to break against, so you make rocks out of men and fire. Jon Snow came through the gate with his hair blown every which way by the cold and the worry that never slept. He had the face of a man who had chosen his deaths and decided to go on living anyway. Behind him padded Ghost, white as the edge of breath, ears pricking and flattening with each new smell. Davos Seaworth huddled in his cloak and stamped his feet beside them, finding some humor in the cold. Grey Worm ghosted across the yard to join them, silent as a blade. Sansa's red hair had its own fire in the gloom as she crossed from the keep, a squire dogging her steps with a lantern that threw her shadow long and strange. You're sure? Jon said, no question in it, only the roughness of a voice that had spent a night without rest. You take the Vanguard. Tormund's grin broke his beard into clumps. I was born for it. You lords and ladies can argue over the rest. Sansa's eyes cut to him, then to Jon. He knows them, she said, the words like something she had to swallow to spit out. How they move. I know one thing, Tormund said. You keep the screamers behind the fire unless we can see what we're screaming at. A horse is meat in the dark. The Dothraki don't hide, came a voice with a soft rasp, and Ser Jorah Mormont stepped from shadow, armor dull at the edges the way old honor is. He had ridden the plains of Essos, and he wore that truth like a small, tired pride. If you put them at the far rear, you break them before the dead touch them. I'll put them where they can live to cut, Tormund said. I know what darkness is. You can't carve it up, night. Not with a scream nor with steel. We keep them to the left of the trenches. We leave lanes, there and there, for the retreat. He jabbed a thick finger at the ground and men with chalk and stakes moved in response. White marks across the black like maps changing the world. Unsullied hold first line, close to the fire, 2 ranks tight, second rank with spears ready to take what the first pushes through. Northern shield men to cover the lanes and pull back to the trench on 2 horn strokes. Not 3. 3 is the watch, Davos muttered. 3 is for them. 2 is fall back, Tormund said. 1 is hold. That's all living men need tonight. Grey Worm inclined his head. We can do this. My men will not break. They don't, Tormund said, and for the flicker of a heartbeat his grin lost its red warmth and something like respect stood behind his teeth. But you're not the only ones here who have a spine. Those from the free folk, we know when to hold rock and when to roll. We go forward hard when they break on the fire. Not before. It will be windy, Jon said. Maybe worse. His eyes tilted to the bruised sky like a man listening for something that wasn't sound. He will bring the storm. If he means to drown us, we give him stones to smash his waves, Tormund said. We brought carts and whatever the little lady of barley had to spare. Wagons here and here. Stakes double set where the ground dips. Dragonglass on the front rows. Pitch ready on the trenches. And I want torches. Hundreds. Don't let them count on our fear. Sansa was looking beyond him toward the Godswood, and the little shrine of old trees that had outlived kings. Bran will be in the heart of that, she said, and her voice had a steadiness that must have cost. If the Night King is everything you say, he will smell that boy like a wolf smells meat. Will you leave a road for those who must run to him? Tormund studied the lay of the ground in his mind, the way a wolf studies wind. I'll keep a path open along the inner ditch, he said. No dead will be able to run fast through the fire when we feed it proper. And we make the snow our friend. It keeps quiet the feet and drinks the blood that would slip men. We pack it hard along that path so the runners can trust it. Runners? Davos asked. We'll need messengers when the horn is swallowed by noise, Tormund said. Fast little shits, he added, looking as if they might spring from the ground. Girls are better. Boys think they'll be noticed. Girls know how to go unseen. He did not look at Arya then. She was there, though, as she oft, and was now, a shadow with eyes hot as coals. She had appeared by Sansa's shoulder and hadn't been noticed until she was tired of being unseen. The hilt of the Valyrian steel dagger sat easy at her waist, the look on her face easy as a cat's while sleeping near a dog it had already scratched bloody once before. Who do you expect to run? She asked, and the small smile that came when Tormund glanced at her was not kindness so much as recognition. Whoever has feet and breath and doesn't love shouting, he said. You look like you could run between snowflakes. She showed teeth. I prefer to choose where I run, she said. Then stay out of the path and use it when you must. Tormund spat into his hand and smeared the spit into his beard like luck. We hold them long enough, and the dragons will burn what we can't cut. The word brought the air down heavy. Daenerys Targaryen made sounds the way a falcon makes them, a little too clean, a little too shaped, before stepping into the circle near Jon. In the gray light, her hair was almost the same shade as the breath that rose from her mouth. She could have been carved out of the snow and made to move by will alone. Her eyes slid over Tormund and did not move from him. The Dothraki ride because that is what they are, she said. They will not cower behind fire, nor will I throw away what they are. Their charge breaks armies. It breaks men, Tormund said gently, and those around them had the sense to pretend the word wasn't a reproach. The dead don't break. They don't flinch when you scream or piss themselves when they see a blade. Give me your screamers when there's something to scream at. Not the dark. They are my people, she said. Tormund shrugged, one shoulder rising like a hill. Then don't turn the dark into their graves. Yora opened his mouth again and Grey Worm took a small breath. Davos looked at the sky and Jon looked at Daenerys. And in that held breath something older than pride and fresher than hope moved. Sansa made the sound of a very quiet scoff and went still. Jon put his hand on Daenerys's hilt, the gesture of an ally more than a lover, and said, He fought them at Hardhome. We do this as he says. For a moment she seemed to consider swallowing the words and spitting back different ones. Then she lifted her chin by the smallest of degrees, and the matter was settled the way battles often are, without a cheer, without relief, with only the certainty of being bound to whatever comes. Very well, she said. Hold them. When you need the dragons, send the signal. You'll see it, Tormund said. If the storm makes blind men of you, then look for where the dead are thickest. Burn there, not on us. Her mouth twitched like the edge of a knife. I know how to use my children. Good. Tormund clapped his hands once, a sound like a stake being driven home. Up then, everyone to their places. The army moved as if Winterfell itself had willed them. The way stones settle into a new wall and decide they were always meant to be there. Unsullied in their ranks with eyes forward and spines like rods of iron, shields lifted, spears angled to form an answer to whatever came. The Dothraki gathered in a black, restless mass to the left of the trenches, muttering to their horses, rocks hung with strips of oily cloth. Northern men, their shields patched and painted, shuffled into the lanes that would, if the worst came, become their escape. Sappers ran along the arcs of the trenches, splashing pitch and oil, patting dry straw into clumps, shoving the last of the stakes into the frozen ground where the snow already took them back. The great trebuchets creaked and whispered and then stilled, as if listening for their first orders. It was then that the Red Woman came. She was there at the outer edge of sight, and then she was not, as if the snow itself had decided to become a woman and forgotten to be snow. She walked without hurry, her face a candle kept behind glass, and the Unsullied let her pass because there was no alternative. Davos made a soft, irritated noise like a man remembering an old debt. She looked at him, and the air between them seemed to recall a night of fog and flames and a butcher's work she had called King's Blood. "Don't try to stop me, Sare," she said, voice the crackle of a hearth in a quiet room. "Not tonight." "I'm not a Sare," Davos said, almost gentle, almost too tired to be angry. "And I won't if you do something worth not stopping." She went to the Dothraki, and they clustered around her like wolves around a strange heat. She spoke in a language most did not know and raised her hands. For a moment it seemed folly in the face of a sky that was beginning to lie about what morning meant. Then she touched the blade of the first arak, and fire uncoiled along steel like a thing that had just been waiting to be woken. A sound rose from the screamers that was not a scream but almost was. One by one, the araks took flame and turned the crowd into a thicket of burning fruit. The little light licked at Tormund's eyes and showed a general's mind there. He did not nod, but his breath came out pleased. "Hold them," he said to Yora, his voice clear as glass. "Charge when you can see faces. Not before, not farther than the pitch." Yora laid a gauntlet hand on the neck of his horse, soothed him with a sound that ached of foreign grasslands. "I will hold them," he said, and something like apology or gratitude touched his voice for an instant. "On your horn, then." "On my horn," Tormund said, and lifted the heavy thing at his side. It had once been a thing for calling reindeer and wives, not death, but the distinction felt thin as paper. He planted his feet in the snow and watched the black field beyond the trenches. Drogon and Regal rose out of the inner ward with the churn of a storm being born, a violent beating of air that rattled spears and made hair jump. Snow and soot billowed, and the dragons were shapes greater than the world for a heartbeat before they were flying, black against the sky that was giving up its pretense of dawn. Jon swung himself up with a familiar, hard economy, and Daenerys moved like she was stepping into a body that was truer than flesh. For a moment they wheeled together above the keep, two shadows with fire in their bellies, and then they were gone, eastward toward where the storm was coming. Silence followed, the sort that makes men hear their own blood. Somewhere a horse stamped and snorted. Somewhere a man coughed and spat onto his boots and thought of luck. Somewhere, a girl with a face like the side of a knife was not where anyone thought she had been a blink before. The dead came like a new night. No trumpet, no banner, only the wrongness of silence thickening. A line of darker dark across the land, the way the tide appears to a man too far from shore. They did not run at first. They came like men who saw no need to hurry, and that was worse. Tormund's hand found the horn and then left it. Not yet. The Unsullied spears tipped and leveled. The Dothraki horses stamped, nostrils flaring at what their eyes could not make sense of. The northern lines shifted to settle, shields angled, the thin iron ring of men readying to raise them lifting into the night. Then the line of night broke into a scatter of moving shapes and the sound came. Feet on snow with no breath above them, the clatter of dead hands on weapons, the low, endless whisper of bones remembering war. The first whites hit the outer reach of the trenches that weren't yet flame and spilled over themselves, a wave trying to climb a wall. Arrows lifted and fell and lifted again, the lack of cries disturbing, as if someone had taken a piece out of the night's song. "Now," Tormund said, and brought the horn to his mouth. The call went out across the field, small at first, picked up by other horns along the line until it laid a net of sound. The Dothraki moved, not forward but sideways, sliding into the pockets he had marked, their flaming araks making arcs like the breath of strange comets. Yora's voice carried, and it was the sound of a man who had been young once and remembered it now because he had to. They rode forward not far, then reined in, cutting the first of the whites that reached the pitch and flung themselves at flame that wasn't there yet. The Unsullied took the first full shock of the rush, their shields locking like scales on a thing that was too big for a name. The trebuchets released, and there it was, a moment of foolish relief as great stones hurled into the dark beyond the sight of men. Some struck, certainly smashing bones and scattering limbs that would crawl. Others punched uselessly into the snow. But it was a beginning, a pulse of defiance, and men need beginnings when ends are all around them. Tormund held the horn and watched the way the whites moved around the not-yet-fire. He saw them feel the trench without knowing feeling, saw the press from behind push the front ranks into the ditch where pitch squelched up into dead mouths and eye sockets. He waited until he could not stand waiting, then blew a single long note. Davos took the signal and raised his arms to the air like a priest to an angry god. The trench did not light. Again, Tormund said, though he had not told himself to speak. Davos waved again. Archers set flaming arrows to strings and the first fell short. The second sparked and died in wet pitch like a hope too early born. The red woman walked out along the trench as if strolling a garden path. Whites clawed at the far side far down the line and men shouted for her to hurry, but her pace did not change. She kneeled and spoke a word and nothing happened. She spoke it again and her voice frayed a little like a rope with too much salt on it, and nothing happened. Tormund could feel the men near him sway toward despair, as if toward a fire in a frozen night. She screamed it then, the word that men should not know, and the ditch erupted as if the earth had breathed. Fire ran along pitch and straw and dead wood, and for a moment it was daylight on the faces of the living. It showed grime and the quick ecstatic ugliness of relief, and it showed the dead in stark truth. Cheeks torn back, eyes filmed over, open mouths still, after all too human. The fire lifted like a wall and the first ranks of whites pushed into it and caught, falling back into their fellows, who caught, who burned and fought to walk out of their fire as if it were only a river. They went on coming and they burned and they went on coming. "Hold," Tormund said to the Unsullied, to the northern men, to himself. "Hold until they make their bridge, and then we cut them off as they climb." He saw the truth of the dead again, the bitter lesson of hard home. They learned, not like men with talk and pride, but like water learns rock. They threw themselves into the flames until their bodies stilled the worst of it, and over those bodies more came, a self-made bridge of corpses. They pressed up onto the far lip and the spears took them, and they fell, and the ones behind climbed again. The Dothraki sliced at the edges where the press was worst, quick savage arcs of fire cutting wedges of darkness, and pulled back before being swallowed. Yora rode with them like a man who had finally found a thing his heart still knew how to beat for. Above them the sky changed. The wind leaped from one direction to another and then decided on all of them at once. The light that wasn't light, the thin, clean mean cold of a storm like a mind, came rolling in, crushing the world into a space too small for breath. Dragons roared in it, a sound too big for something that was only an animal, and shadows fought in cloud. When Drogon's flame came, it was like a star being scraped across the ground. Whites burned and shrieked without voices to do it with, and the air soothed itself briefly with heat. Then the storm othered it again and the ground steamed, and the dead moved faster than steam. Tormund felt the horn heavy in his hand. "Two," he said to himself. The lines were beginning to bow. The Unsullied went a pace back in order, as if stepping off a ship onto a low pier. The northern shieldmen showed their teeth, and the clever ones remembered to keep them closed. In the lanes, men moved without running, in the way that says running would be a kindness too much to hope for. The Dothraki circled to cover the retreat with quick savage bursts, like wolves darting to confuse a bull, and fell back to the second mark. The first breach came where Tormund had expected it to, at the shallow dip where the trench had been laid farther out to catch the deepest part of the slope. The whites made a pile of themselves quickly there and began to clamber like lice. A giant shape loomed behind them, a thing that had been a giant once and was now a hill that hated life. It took the trench in one stupid step and came on, fire sucking along its fur, beard smoldering. Northern arrows thunked into its chest and made no difference. Lyanna Mormont was there with the men of her little island. The girl with her jaw set and her banner as tall as a tree. She did not pause. She ran at the thing like a thrown knife. Brienne shouted something hoarse and tender all at once. Jaime moved as if a rope tied to his heart had been pulled. They were too far. Lyanna slid under a swing of the giant's hand that caved the skull of a grown man like a full wineskin. It bent to roar at her, and her face did not change. She drove the dragonglass spear into the one place where even a giant can't help but keep a soft spot, and the light went out of its eyes, and it fell on her like a love too big to survive. The dead all around them went into a frenzy, and their frenzy was not like the living's. It had no joy and no fear and no end. The horn sounded again, and the lines moved back to the edge of the trench. The fire was a low fury now, choked by corpses. The Unsullied pivoted and stamped and kept their spears working with the smooth cruelty that is only discipline turned to war. Grey Worm's eyes were calm as stone. He was thinking of Missandei and not thinking of her at the same time, keeping her safe by not letting her be in his mind fully where death could see her and reach. He set the draft of the retreat with small gestures and made it look like a dance done badly. And it was enough. In the air the dragons slashed again and the storm struck them. Regal came down lower than he meant to, and Jon's legs locked around the saddle as men lock against pain. He felt the cold of the storm inside his mouth, on his teeth. He saw shapes below and could not tell if they were the dead or the men who were fighting them. Drogon flamed along the edge of the second trench and made a short hot day there. And men cheered because men will cheer anything that looks like an answer. Somewhere beyond that light, Viserion screamed. The sound was like weapons being made and thrown away forever. The gods would held its silence because old trees do not get involved in men's brief bright troubles. Bran sat beneath the pale heart tree with his eyes like winter pools and the ravens in his head. Theon crouched with his men of iron beside him, the bow heavy in hands that had learned other heaviness, and tried very hard not to be the boy who had once wished for crowns that did not fit. He had killed men who had cried, he had killed boys who had not understood, and he had taken so many things he did not deserve. He looked at the boy who was older than anyone and older than him and thought, "Not this. Not for me. Not tonight." Arya moved along the inner path Tormund had ordered kept, and it was clear and quiet because he had been right. The fire drank the noise and the path drank feet like wine. She had the weight of the dagger at her waist like a promise and her new spear strapped across her back. She moved like water does when it decides to be elegant. Around her, snow was falling and not falling. Every flake she passed seemed to hang a moment to watch her go by. She did not run. She went where she had decided she would be, and it was always where death did not expect to see her. In the crypts the air was close and old, thick with the breath of those whose names were carved in stones that men touched as they passed. Sansa stood with Tyrion and the huddled and the brave and the ones who knew that both things live in the same chest, and she had a dagger too. She had not expected to be a woman who carried one and felt right with it. In fact, she had not expected many things about herself to turn out to be true. She went among the fearful and spoke in a voice that was solid enough to lean against. "Dragonglass spears here," she told a smock-wearing keeper of candles who had been a hunter once. "Keep them ready. If the worst comes, aim for the joints." She did not think to explain more. He nodded and his mouth made a thin line. Tyrion watched her like a man counting something and finding the sum both more and less than he had hoped. "You think of everything," he said very quietly, when she had a space to breathe. "No," she said. "I think of what I can, and I do not make the people around me smaller by pretending that is everything. There are others here who know what I do not." "The Onion Knight would like that line," Tyrion said. He'd repeat it over a bowl of stew until it became his. He took a foolish half-step closer, and when she did not flinch or smirk, something easy went into his shoulders. "He is a practical man. I have learned to value those." Sansa looked at the stones. "There's never enough of them." The first stone cracked like old bread. The second broke with the sound of a rib being stepped on, and the weight behind it felt to everyone as if it might go on forever. Fingers clawed through old mortar. A woman screamed and did not try to quiet it. There was no use for quiet now. Sansa's hand tightened on the dagger and Tyrion's good hand. His only hand closed on a short spear that Master-at-Arms had left with him for the shape of the thing. Tormund's line bent hard and then held, and when it held, he drove spear and body into the worst of the breach with a joy so fierce it outran fear and left only something heavy and red-hot at the center of him. He had lost men on the far shore to cold and to fear and to bad luck that men pretend is not the same as carelessness. He had lost a son. He remembered that boy's laugh as he crushed a dead thing's skull beneath his boot heel, and it made a sense that no prayer does. He saw Samwell Tarly's round, terrified face among the northern men and wanted to laugh. The boy had a bit of fire in him after all, and that was a surprise he would carry like a charm. He saw Ed die, and the laugh never came. He bellowed the way only a man from north of the wall can bellow, a sound like a moose with his horns in a tree, and the living rallied because living things love to be told what to do when they already want to do it. There were many places where the dead came on and the living bent and did not break, but there were not enough of them. The trench nearest the center had lost its fire entirely, and the dead thickened there like frost. Tormund raised his horn to call for the dragons and hesitated because he could see them swooping already, and because he knew they would not see what he saw even if his horn split the world. He let the horn drop and used his hands for killing instead, because you can trust your hands to be close to the things they must do. Drogon's first broad brush of flame cleared the dead from the gap and seared the snow into glass. The heat staggered men, and some fell, and some did not rise quickly enough before the second wave came. Daenerys leaned with her belly against the saddle and thought of nothing but the rush of air through fire cleared by storm. She saw the line, thin and brave, and the dead pressing, and she burned the dead, and she burned the snow, and she burned the world in a path, because that was her gift. She saw a place where men were disappearing into a slow-moving churn of nothing and dropped lower, no longer thinking anything but to cut that place with flame and save what could be pulled from it. Whites leaped at Drogon's sides and caught and burned, clinging until their hands were ash. He roared and his tail smashed, and their bodies fell and burst like sacks of old leaves. Still they swarmed. The ground was alive in a way that made the words ugly. Somewhere, not near but somehow too close, Viserion tore at the sky and blue fire ripped night into a wound. Jon descended with regal as if the dragon were being reeled in by the heart. The storm was like a net on his wings. The whites climbed up the stone of Winterfell like moss on an old tree. Jon saw men he knew and men he had never learned the names of fighting in clusters now, the lines gone to knots. He landed hard in the inner yard and slid from the saddle, numbed down to the marrow. He wanted to run to where the Godswood was, where Bran sat, where everything might end in a way that at least meant something. But he could not make himself leave the yard with its little world of death that did not need him but would be worse without him. He drew Longclaw and it felt like an admission or a homecoming. He couldn't decide which. "Go on," Tormund's voice said inside him, as if the big man were standing next to his ear. "Trust the people who are doing what you ask them to do." He could not. He could a little. He cut a dead thing and then another and felt the rhythms come back from a night on the wall when the world had been simpler because he had been ignorant, not because it had been kinder. He moved through bodies to where the stair to the wall ran up and took it two at a time. Above, he could see the shape of the Godswood through the storm. A darker dark, a cluster of old truths. He began to run along the wall. In the crypts, the dead were an uglier truth than most. They came with their mistakes still on them. Old wounds, gaps in teeth, chips in bone where a younger man had slid in a foot at river's edge. They were not the clean new dead. They were the dead of Winterfell, and they were home, and that made it worse. Sansa had never killed anything that had once been a good father or almost one. She had never killed her own memory. She learned quickly. She drove the dagger into the base of a neck and twisted like Arya had shown her years and lives ago, and the thing stopped moving, and she stepped back into a cluster of women and men who had no more training than she had had 5 heartbeats before. Tyrion's spear darted and snagged and did enough. Blood, dark and old and new, speckled his face, and he wiped his eyes with a forearm that smelled of dust. He felt a kind of clarity he had not felt since he was younger, before wine had become a place to live. He saw that clarity in Sansa's profile, and it twisted his heart strangely and pleasantly, as if someone had wrung water from a cloth too dry to give any. "We can make it to the far tunnel," he said. "There are doors. Wooden, but they were made to keep out men," Sansa said. "Not this." She drove her dagger again. "We make a line by the arch, narrow the gap. Give them less space to come through at once. If we live," she added, "we will forgive each other later for the things we were afraid to do tonight." He smiled crookedly because it was either that or something that would make everything worse. Arya moved in the dark above ground like a rumor, being careful not to be believed. The storm pulled her hair and tried to make her eyes water, and she did not let it. She did not go to the Godswood because that is where anyone else would have gone with what she had and who she was, and that would be foolish. She went instead where the dead were thickest, and then where they re-not, and then where they were again, making a pattern out of absence until the pattern put her near where she might choose to be. Beric Dondarrion had the face of a man who had been used hard by gods, and he used his sword like someone aware they might yet be asked to pay again. The Hound hated the fire and the night and himself, and he moved anyway when he saw a small person in the dark who was not a child, and who made him remember someone who had once told him that he could be different and that would not be a shame. Melisandre stood on an inner step and watched the dead crawl across winter as if across a tablecloth. She felt old magic, like a tide that had decided to leave and not come back. She was not done. But the thing she had come for was not all burning and not all prophecy. It had a small face and a quick hand and eyes that remembered names she had once said. Arya came to her as if the world had decided to make a straight line of everything, and they looked at each other. "You said blue eyes," Arya said flatly. "I did," Melisandre said. "If you are a knife, child, be sharp tonight." Her voice gentled and did not weaken. "What do we say to the god that would have all of us?" Arya's mouth tilted. "Not a thing," she said, and she went. Tormund had a free folk's respect for the ones who do their work on the edge. He did not know where the little wolf had gone, but he knew she went where the world would break differently because of her. He kept the Vanguard a vanguard even as the line had retreated behind fire. Men thought vanguards are for going forward. Sometimes they are for being the last to leave. He did not allow a rout because he did not believe in them. He battered whites off the backs of Unsullied, who could not spare hands to remove them, and yanked northern men by the collars when they forgot where the lane was. He shouted until his throat was blood. He blew his horn in the storm, and it did not matter except that men saw him blowing and remembered what 2 blasts means and went that way. Grey Worm made a pivot at the second mark, and it worked. It pulled the dead into a snarl that made them easier to cut. He had thought he might die with an image of Missandei in his eyes, but instead he had a clear view of Tormund's ridiculous beard grinning as he bellowed some obscenity about a bear woman. In another life, Grey Worm would have shaken his head and perhaps smiled. Tonight he set his spear point at the angle to catch a falling white and throw it back into its fellows. He learned quickly the trick of making dead bodies into impediments for more dead bodies. It felt like an insult to life, but also like a means of keeping it. Jon reached the parapet near the east gate and saw, through the blur of snow and ash, a figure moving through the dead with something that looked like a forgotten grace. At first he thought it was someone he had left behind in another part of his story, a woman with a list and a gift for shadows, but it was not her and was her both. He saw the way the dead folded around a new absence in their pattern and knew it was his sister because he had learned that she was always where the pattern broke. He shouted without words, and she did not look up. He ran, then, along the wall toward the Godswood, because he had delayed and he did not want to be late to the end of the world. Theon's arrows did good work longer than they had any right to. The dead's heads jerked back at last when the shafts sank to their fletching, and the men beside him began to believe in what they were doing, which is never a bad thing even when it is about to be crushed. The Godswood smelled like winter's tongue, sharp and clean, and the snow there had a way of seeming to fall more gracefully, as if apologizing. Bran sat and saw crows and dragons and the way a girl moved like a thrown stone that had remembered how to walk. He came back to himself and looked at Theon. "You're a good man," Bran said in the voice of a boy. Theon felt his throat close. He had been a very bad man. He was, at this moment, the only kind he hoped to be. He did what men do when the measure is finally taken. He did not speak because it would not have helped. He drew another arrow and set it to the string. The Night King came into the Godswood as if he had been walking forever and had just chosen to arrive. He walked like someone who had never stumbled. The air around him was something like the absence of warmth, and the snow seemed eager to be near him. The White Walkers around him moved like elegant knives. Theon's men shook, but not all at once. Some held, some did not. Theon shot until there were no arrows and then broke the bow on a white and then picked up a spear he did not care if he knew how to use. He stood between the old boy and the old tree and the old death and did what a man must do when he realizes duty tastes better than all the sweets he stole from other men's tables. He went forward when there was no world forward to go into, and he died there, and for a moment his face was a boy's again. Spoiled, brave, sorry, proud. Jon reached the gate to the Godswood, and the dead gathered there like a story about to repeat itself. He cut and shoved and bellowed, and then a dragon roared and a wash of heat cleared the wall above his head of things trying to climb it. Drogon circled once and then was drawn away by pain he could not ignore. Daenerys looked down and saw Jon and wanted to say his name but did not, because names do not sharpen steel. She pulled away to the yard because Yora was down and on his back and 20 things were leaping to be the one to bite his face. She did not think. She did not need to. In the crypts, Tyrion and Sansa made their narrow line at the archway work a while longer than some songs might say. They were dirty and frightened and funny together in the way that happens when people who know each other's worst corners have decided to stand in them. Varys, who had always been better when battles were plans and not facts, shoved a dragonglass spear into the chest of a thing that had been a small lord once, and he did it badly and it worked. Missandei kept 2 women who were about to break from breaking with words in a language neither of them spoke, which is not as hard as it sounds when the words come with the truth of a voice that has decided to be brave in a room with no doors. Arya came to the Godswood not by any path men had made but by ignoring those paths in favor of the quiet between trees. She saw the Night King at a distance that hurt her teeth. He had his eyes on the boy and the tree, and the snow around him seemed too interested in the way he moved. The White Walkers near him had a grace she hated. She counted them and then stopped counting and made the count smaller inside her. She had moved past men who had eyes and did not see. She had moved past the dead who had no eyes to see with at all. She moved now through cold so complete it made her think of heat. She did not think of her father. She did not think of her mother's voice. She did not think of the list. She thought of the point, and of where it would be, and of what a hand could do when the first promise it ever made was to hang on. Tormund heard the collapse before he saw it. Sound moved strange in a storm. It came like a door slamming in another house. He looked toward the Godswood and saw the way the dead shifted there, turning toward a new hunger. He lifted the horn to his mouth and blew 2 long notes that made no difference except to men who were still listening, and enough of them were. He trusted the quiet boy and the little wolf and the man he had followed across the world, and he trusted his own hands, and he swung again and again until his arms felt like logs that had burned to ash and kept acting like wood out of habit. Grey Worm saw the same movement and pivoted what men he could spare toward the inner yard. He made a wedge that might yet be mistaken for a gift. Davos stood on a stair and waved and shouted and kept his voice from sounding like a prayer because he did not intend to ask any god for anything. Brienne carved a path with Jaime anchored at her side like a bad bright idea she could not get rid of and did not really want to. Gendry ran where signals said to run because he was good at running and better at not stopping. The Hound shoved Beric ahead of him and Beric laughed without much breath and called him something rude and true. In the Godswood the air held still for 1 beat of Arya's heart. The Night King extended his hand toward Bran, who did not blink. The spear that had been Theon's last went cold in the snow. A White Walker turned his head because a flake of snow had brushed a cheek that could not feel, and that was not supposed to matter. Arya came from the dark as if she had been thrown by it, and she was all motion and nothing but decision. The knife missed a heart that did not beat, and a hand like winter closed around her throat and lifted her from herself. The dagger fell. Her eyes saw it. Her hand did what it had been taught to do when faces would not. It let one thing go to take another. She dropped the knife, caught it with the other hand, and put it where it would end everything. The Night King shattered in silence that screamed. The cold broke like glass. The sound in the godswood was a long groan as of 1,000 ropes slacking all at once as the dead went loose in their bindings and fell. The wights in the yard collapsed into the positions where death had first found them, and the ones on the walls slid with a soft, steady sound like heavy rain. Drogon's sides heaved, and he shook himself as if waking. Rhaegal screamed sharp with shock. Viserion howl cut off as if a hand had closed his throat from inside. Jon stumbled forward and caught Arya hard enough that she made a noise of protest and then made another that was not that at all. He held her like people hold something that matters because they have not won many things that do. Bran's eyes returned to the world like a bird deciding to land. He looked at his brother and his sister, and his face did not change, and something in him did. In the yard, Daenerys sank to her knees beside Yora, whose eyes were clear and bewildered. "I thought," he said, and coughed, and the cough hurt worse than anything. "I thought you would burn the world tonight." "I tried," she said, and there were tears on her face that steamed in the heat of the dragon's smoke. "The world wouldn't let me." She put her hand on his chest and felt his heart like an animal that has decided to stay. He smiled with the corner of his mouth and realized he could do that still. He was not sure whether to be surprised or ashamed or grateful. He chose the one that would make standing possible. The crypts went quiet the way rooms do after a feast, where many things were said and some were truer than others. Men panted. Women leaned on each other. Sansa wiped her dagger on her skirt the way a practical woman will when there is nothing else to do, and she looked at Tyrion and could not help the small, exhausted sound that was almost a laugh. "You were right," she said. "There were doors. We didn't need them. Useful doors often are like that," he said. His hand shook as he put the spear down, and he let it, because there was no dignity in pretending otherwise now. "Are we alive?" "We are," she said. "I don't know who else is." Melisandre stepped out into the last of the snow. She took off the choker that made her beautiful, and her beauty slipped away like a mistake corrected. She went into the night like a boat slipping its mooring on a quiet tide. Davos watched her go, and his face did something that might have been forgiveness from far enough away to be harmless. The pale light that had pretended to be dawn began to act like it honestly might be. The snow was filthy, trodden into paste. The pitched trenches steamed like soup in a poor hoe. SE men moved with the slow, sudden caution of people remembering they had bodies. Crying began and was stopped and began again elsewhere. The smell of burned meat and old wet rock was everywhere. Tormund sat on a toppled cart and laughed until he couldn't breathe, and then cried loudly once and got it over with. Jon came into the yard with Arya and Bran and a dozen others, and he looked at Tormund in that baffled, grateful way he had, as if a problem had solved itself without instructions. "You held," Jon said. "You mad bastard." Tormund wiped his nose with the back of his hand and then grimaced because it had come away with something that could be either blood or the kind of snot only real cold makes. You see, the dark can be cut after all. You just do it where it hates it most." Daenerys rose, and the men nearest her learned again how to look at her with fear and something like worship, because she was framed in the wreckage and the steam and the dragon at her back and had not melted. She looked at Tormund and then at Jon and then at the survivors in the yard and saw that the lot of them were not hers and might be and might never be, and that was the truth a queen must live with. "You chose well," she said to Jon, and in her mouth it was either praise or an indictment, and she could not decide which herself. Jon looked across at the Dothraki, who were fewer than they had been but not gone. He looked at Yora, who was alive after thinking he would like to die a good death, and he looked at Grey Worm, who stood straight though his hands shook in a small and private way. He looked at Sansa, who had a smear of someone else's blood on her cheek and did not seem to mind in the least, and then at Arya, who held the dagger as if it were tired and she would let it sleep a while now. He looked at Tormund, who had bent the Vanguard's purpose into a shape that could return home from a battle. "You did this?" Jon said to him, and Tormund snorted. "I? The little wolf killed the big one, your dragon woman burned what she could, and your boy sat there like a stump and let it happen. And my beard did the rest? Come now." He leaned forward, eyes bright. But I'll take a horn of something and a cow to eat for my wisdom. We'll find the cow, Davos said hoarsely, and at that, some laughter broke like fish rising. It was ugly and glorious and sounded like living. The long day that followed did not feel like victory because no day after that night could. Men rooted through the dead like gardeners pulling weeds, careful to prick the heads off anything that twitched for the wrong reason. Bodies were laid out in rows where they could be, because you cannot stack grief without it falling on you. The smallest of the children who had hidden in cellars were carried up to see the sky, and some cried because it was too bright and some because they didn't remember it, which is worse. Tormund helped drag a cart loaded with shields into a corner where men could lay to die if they hadn't yet decided to. He found Sam, who was sitting on a barrel trying to pretend he wasn't, and thumped him on the back so hard the poor boy wheezed. "You did well," Tormund told him. "You fought." "I tried," Sam said, his voice like wet wood. "I mostly survived. Ed." He couldn't finish the name and did not have to. "He was a grumpy cunt and brave as a rock," Tormund said. "We can say both. We will drink to him with something that makes us forget what makes us remember." Sam nodded and kept nodding until it seemed like it might be all he would do for the rest of his life. Gilly was found, and she came to him with the baby and a look that said that all things were again weight in the world. Sam reached for both. His hands shook and became still. Grey Worm walked the yard like a man checking the posts of a fence after a storm. He counted, but not out loud, and the numbers he did not find he carried inward. A ledger closed when it must be. Missandei touched his sleeve and he did not startle. He merely stopped, which for him was the same as flinging his arms around her. They said few words because their words had been used up, but their eyes remembered how to speak. Brienne and Jaime stood together and looked too long at the place where Lyanna Mormont had fallen. Brienne's face did the thing it did when she was holding more than any one person should carry and making it look like an ordinary load. "She died as she wanted," she said, as if that were a blessing and not a curse. Jaime nodded with his head tipped to one side, as if agreeing with the hilt of a sword. "So few do. It's not a mercy I believe in, but it is one I respect." Sansa moved among the survivors and did what she could do. She told them things they could do next, and it made them feel as if life might be possible when their hands were not busy. She looked at Dany and knew there would be a day when they would set knives on a table between them and decide which to use for bread and which for throats. She also knew this was not that day. She nodded once to the Dragon Queen and went on telling a woman how to boil rags without boiling her hands. Jon found Bran again and stood a moment looking at the boy in the chair under the tree. It was bright now in the Godswood, the snow drunk with light. "You saw it all," Jon said, and he did not make it a question this time either. "Enough," Bran said. "Not everything. No one sees everything." "Is it over?" Jon asked, and he was a man for whom endings had become suspicious. "This part," Bran said, "and that would have to be enough. Tormund did as he knows. You did as you are, Arya." He did not finish. Some things do not need finishing. Jon went and found Tormund in the yard breaking frozen bread with the edge of a little hatchet. "You asked for a cow," Jon said. Tormund grinned. "You found me a skinny deer," he said, and tore the bread in half and handed part of it without looking up. "You leave to the south after tea?" "Yes." "Soon," Jon said, which meant he did not know, and that was the truth. "Thank you." Tormund made a coarse noise of dismissal and hid poorly the way his eyes warmed. "You let a man do what he's good at," he said. "That's all any man wants. Except for me. I also want a very tall woman who could break me in half. That will make a fine story to tell when I have more teeth in my head than I do now." Jon laughed because something in him had always laughed at the wrong things and because it felt right anyway. He clapped Tormund's shoulder and felt the thick strength of the man the way one feels the integrity of a beam one leans against. "I'm glad you're here," he said. Tormund squinted at the pale morning and the bodies being moved with care and the living stepping around them, carefully, as people do when they are still almost ghosts. "I'm glad your stupid black hair is still on your head," he said. "It makes it easier to find you when you're doing something foolish." Ghost came and pressed his head into Jon's hip, a steadying like a third leg sprouting, and Jon's hand found the ruff of his ears. "We'll need you again," he told the direwolf, and Ghost looked up with eyes that already knew this. Before noon, they built pyres for those whose bodies they had. The Godswood's ground would not drink ash as quickly as a field, but it was cleaner, and there were enough old gods watching to make it almost bearable. The words said over the pyres were plain because plain words are more polite to grief. Men came forward to light them and men drew back, and the fires took and kept and gave back the only thing they had to give, heat. Davos stood with Jon as gray smoke smeared the sky. "You did a clever thing," the old smuggler said. "I argued once for trickery," Jon said. "I told a man to do what he does best, and he did it. That wasn't me. That was him." Davos rubbed the bridge of his nose with thumb and forefinger as if the truth there made his head hurt. Leadership is mostly knowing when to put your hand on a horse's arse and when to let the horse kick, if you take my meaning. Jon smiled without humor. "Ido. I learned it too late before. I wanted to be the blade and not the hand that points it." "Well," Davos said carefully, "there are times a blade is the only argument that gets listened to." Daenerys came then, and the air changed. She stood with them without speaking and watched the smoke with eyes that held in equal parts refusal and acceptance. At last she said, "In Meereen, the dead were questions. Here they were answers." She glanced back toward the charblack trenches and the pale walls of a castle older than her house. "I owe your wild friend something I cannot repay." "Meat," Davos said promptly. "Beer. A laugh. These are currencies he understands. Don't confuse him with coins and crowns." She gave him a look that could have been frost or smile. "There will be crowns," she said softly. This solved a problem. It did not solve them all. "Nothing does," Jon said, and there was no argument you could put to that. But this was a good problem to have solved. Through the day, people came out of rooms with new eyes. The kitchens made watery stew because water was what they had and stew was what mouths could bear. Men found jokes that were not cruel and women corrected them gently, and both types of people accepted the corrections with grace because they were ashamed of dying and not dying and did not want to make anyone else feel that way. Tormund told tales in the corner of the yard where something like warmth gathered. Of a bear he had loved, of snow that fell so thick it carpeted the beds in the caves, of a giant who had once thrown him into a river and then had to leap in and fetch him out for fear of laughing himself to death. Brienne passed by and his eyes followed and his mouth said a thing it perhaps should not have just loudly enough to be heard. She lifted her chin and he smiled wider because he had been seen and not killed for it, and that is a luxury. In the evening, because even nights after long nights have their evenings, the storm settled into the memory of a storm. The sky cleared in strips like old bandages. Men lay down in corners and did not sleep because they were asleep too quickly. The dragons padded to the far sides of the yard and curled with their heads on their own great paws, smoke seeping from their nostrils like thoughts they hadn't finished thinking. Regal's sides rose and fell like a bellows that had been overworked and now must be humored. Jon found Arya atop the battlements, legs tucked up as if she were small and not small at all. The dagger lay across her knees. She did not look intoxicated by what she had done, which is a blessing. She looked like someone who had finished a task and was deciding whether to be cruel to herself about it. Jon sat beside her, and Ghost came and put his chin on the wall between them and the world. "You did it," Jon said, "unnecessary and perfect." "I did," Arya said. "I never put it on my list. The name was too big. You've always been more practical than the rest of us." She snorted. "Practical would have stayed in the crypts and hid." "That's a word," he allowed. "I don't think it's the right one for you." She turned her head to look at him, and he saw the girl he had once told to stick them with the pointy end and a woman with a gaze that made room for storms to pass through. "Tormund," she said. "He kept a path clear. He told me to use it if I must." "He knows the lay of a fight," Jon said. "He knows what not to do, which is a rarer thing. I would have charged with the screamers into the dark, because what else would you do with a blade and a horse and too much fear?" She put the dagger away as if it were finally truly finished with for the moment. "He deserves wine," she said. "He'll get it," Jon said. "He'll probably take it if he doesn't." She leaned her head against the stone for a moment and closed her eyes like someone taking a step only she knew how to balance. "There will be other nights," she said. "There will," Jon said. "We have the luxury of worrying about them again." Near midnight, when the fires had been banked and the smoke had thinned to a curtain, a group gathered in the great hall because people always know when a hall must be used the way it was meant to be. Sansa sat in the seat that was both her father's and no one's now, and Jon stood near, not at the head and not at the side, a man that the room turned toward without anyone pointing. Daenerys took a place where she could see everyone and be seen by everyone, and that was a skill she had learned somewhere south of this cold and would not forget in it. Tormund had a horn of beer the size of a small boy, and the small boy who had been carrying it for him looked too proud to be tired. Davos leaned against a pillar and tried to remember the words to a song he did not know and found that he did not need them. Grey Worm reported numbers in a voice that did not tremble. Tyrion told the company lies that were true, that they had been brave, that the dead had been impossible, that they had made something out of a thing that threatened to make nothing out of everything. Missandei translated Dothraki laughter into words that made it beautiful in a different way, and the men who laughed did not mind that their triumphs sounded soft when she carried them. They liked it. Brienne lifted her cup to Lyanna Mormont and all the hall stood, and their silence made of the girl a thing as tall and as stubborn as she had been. Jon spoke last because he had learned that the last voice makes more of a mark and because he wanted to hear everyone else before he decided what he would say. He did not raise his cup because he wanted not to drink tonight. The taste of smoke and blood would only sour anything else. "We live," he said. "Some of those we love do not. We have done what the world needed. We did it together. We will go on doing what we must. The next enemies will have voices and faces that can talk back. I cannot promise you that will make them easier." A small scatter of laughter, the quiet kind. "Tormund Giantsbane," he said, and Tormund looked up as if he had been caught with his hand somewhere it ought not to be. "Commanded the Vanguard." "That he did," came a voice from the back that might have been the hounds and might have been someone else who had learned to grumble as a form of prayer. "He kept us alive long enough to win," Jon said. "He did not throw men where there was nothing for them to cut. He gave us time and ground and fire." He looked at the big man and could not help smiling. "Tomorrow, I will tell him what every lord says when a thing like this is done." "What's that then?" Tormund demanded, eyes bright. "That he will be allowed to do it again." Groans and laughter. Even Dany smiled, and Sansa's mouth made a shape like a knife becoming a spoon for a lucky minute. "Tonight," Jon went on, "we thank him as we thank each other, with words and with a roof over our heads and with the knowledge that none of us did this alone." He let the words sit. He had learned that words must sometimes be left alone to say their bit without hands fussing at them. "Rest," he said finally. "Heal if you can. In the morning we will see who we are and what we do next." The hall broke into small knots, like ice cracked by a thaw. People clung and let go and promised and canceled those promises with kisses and then made new ones. Tormund drained the huge horn and thumped it down on a table, and some beer sloshed and ran like a river that was not important. He swayed a fraction and then steadied. Brienne passed by with a plate and he said her name like a prayer and a battle cry. She gave him a look that would have skewered a dead thing, and he laughed and bowed enormous and precise, and she did not smile but something gentled in her shoulders. Dany sought Jon with her eyes and found him by a pillar, watching the people he was somehow at the center of. She went to him and the space between them remembered both fire and snow. "You trusted him," she said. "You might have led the Vanguard yourself." "I would have killed more men by mistake," he said, "and died sooner. I know what I am and what I am not." "What are you?" Her voice held the kind of curiosity that shows when a person wants to be generous and is afraid that being so will cost them. "A man who can fight," he said, "and who can choose the right people to fight in the right places." "I didn't always know that. I thought I had to be the point of the spear. Tormund reminded me that sometimes the hand that holds the spear keeps it from being wasted. I needed him." She looked at him long enough to be impolite. "I need you," she said, and she did not mean only for this. He did not answer with words. He had learned too that silence can be a truth when it is not used to hide. He leaned his shoulder into the pillar and looked at the hall that would be his and never be his and, for tonight, was only a room full of living people who had been expecting to be dead. Outside, the snow began again, softer now, a kind of blessing that required no belief. The trenches hissed where embers met the flakes. The gods would stood as it had stood before men put names to winters, and the heart tree remembered the taste of blood the same way it remembered the taste of rain and did not find itself changed by either. The night was not hollow now. It held the sound of breath on stone and the small movements of things that meant sleep. Above the walls, the ravens arranged themselves and made small comments to each other about the foolishness and bravery of men. Before he found a corner to lie down in and lose his body to rest, Tormund went through the gate and out onto the field because he liked the way the world looked when it was done noticing itself. He walked along the line where the cheese had changed everything and spat into the snow for the pure satisfaction of seeing something warm make an indent. He remembered Hardhome and the way the dead had leapt like a single thought. He remembered the faces of men he had brought south who would not go farther now. He made a rude sign at the dark that might yet hold gods and laughed because it was rude and because he had earned the right. "Come on then," he told the night. "Come again if you fancy it. I know you now. I'll set fire where you hate it. I'll keep a path clear for the ones who can run knives through your heart. I'll make lanes for my brothers to live through. I'm a stone in your water. I won't move." He turned and went back to the castle that had once been an enemy and now felt like a mountain turned into a house. He passed under the gate and a guard dozed and woke and tried to look as if he had been awake the whole time, and Tormund winked at him and did not make a joke because he had grown a little kinder in the last hours, which is a thing men sometimes do when they live. The fires whispered and the stones retained the heat of bodies. In the great hall, an old dog found a bone and decided it would be a pillow instead of a meal, which is a luxury and a choice and both fine. The dragons dreamed large dreams and turned them slowly in their sleep. Arya slept with one hand under her cheek and one near the dagger, not because she feared but because it had learned its way there. Sansa slept with her jaw clenched and then let it go, the way you do when at last no one is looking. Grey Worm did not sleep but sat with his back against a wall and his eyes half shut and thought of a beach he had once promised to see. And Missandei slid down the wall beside him without touching and then did touch and the wall did not mind. Davos snored because the honest do. Tyrion dreamt he was talking and for once it was not to save his life. Jon did not dream at first because the dead had taken his dreams and then he dreamt of snow falling on a quiet yard and the sound it does not make. Dany lay awake a long time and then slept, and she did not see fire when her eyes closed. Bran sat beneath the tree and did not sleep and did not wake, and the birds outside time rearranged themselves in his mind until results were pictures that no one in the hall would live to see. It has been said that battles are choices written in iron and snow. Where the Vanguard stands, men live long enough to make other choices. This night, the Vanguard had been a big man who loved a tall woman he had not yet properly met and who knew the dark in the way that matters. He had put men where they could be rocks, and made fire into a wall, and carved a path for a knife to run where it needed. He would never call himself the shape of any fate. He would say he blew a horn and hit things with it when the horn made no sound loud enough. He would be right in his way, in the morning, and it felt as if there might be one now. Men would argue about kings and crowns and whose names went nearest the top of a list meant to outlive anyone now alive. They would put their faith in different fires. They would misunderstand and be forgiven or punished, and many of them would deserve both. For tonight, the choice had been made and had held. The dead had broken as water breaks against a thing that will not move, and the living settled around that rock and knew, for a rare and wild span of hours, the pleasure of being the tide that remained. The snow kept falling, softer yet, as if someone had learned how to be gentle, and Winterfell breathed, and the breath did not smoke quite as much as before.